All right, everybody, welcome back to the show. Thanks so much for being here with me today. I'm your host, Nolan, and we got a lot to get into today. We got a good show coming up for you, lots to discuss. We're going to start off our main story. We'll be discussing the latest on the Ukraine-Russia war. We have a lot of updates specifically from the past week that we have to get into that we haven't discussed here on the show, but it's important to be discussing them. Just yesterday, we had new sanctions imposed by the United States onto Russian oil companies, so we'll get into everything involving that and the implications of that move. We'll also discuss Zelensky's meeting at the White House last week, which we haven't gotten to yet here on the show, but it was an incredibly important meeting, and it sets the stage for the coming weeks of this conflict. So we'll talk all about that conflict up in Russia and Ukraine. We'll also discuss what happened just the last couple days involving the Israel-Hamas ceasefire and the latest on Marco Rubio's talks about that. We'll talk about JD Vance's visit to Israel and the chaos that ensued when he arrived there. And we'll talk about all this today and more on the Quest for Clarity podcast.
Americanism, not globalism.
I am not a slave. I am a free citizen.
There should be no Federal Reserve system.
Only America first.
End all of these wars. America is trying to play empire. We want everything released, and you're actively covering it up. It's not America first to be pushing our influence in areas where it shouldn't be. We're run by people that don't understand what they're doing and don't understand the ramifications of the policies they're enacting. That's an incredibly dangerous situation. All right, before we begin, if everyone wouldn't mind going right down below this video and hitting like and subscribe, I'd really appreciate it. It helps me out a lot here on YouTube. Also, if you wouldn't mind going to my Instagram, X, and Spotify accounts and giving all those pages a follow, I'd really appreciate that as well. But let's get right into the first story of today, which is the latest on the Ukraine-Russia war. So just yesterday afternoon, we had Secretary Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, announcing that the U.S. would be imposing new sanctions on Russian oil companies. So I'll start off here by reading the New York Times report on this. Trump imposes sanctions on Russian oil companies and as his frustrations with Putin mounts. So here we'll start quoting the article. This is from the New York Times yesterday. Quote, President Trump announced on Wednesday that he was imposing significant new sanctions on Russia for the first time in his second term, underscoring a new degree of frustration with President Putin after a plan for the two leaders to meet in Budapest fell apart. New sanctions were announced just as the president sat down in the Oval Office with NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, who had flown to Washington on behalf of a coalition of European leaders desperate to keep Mr. Trump on the side of Ukraine. The sanctions targeted Russia's two largest oil companies, Rosneft and Lukoil. Quote, now is the time to stop the killing and for an immediate ceasefire, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said in an announcement that described the oil companies as twin engines of the Kremlin's war machine. So now we have new sanctions on Russian oil, which is a major, probably the biggest escalation on the U.S. side in the last few months, because this means that we now have to kind of follow through here on enforcing those sanctions. We just saw the EU try to enforce those sanctions that they had set just a couple months back when they were actually forced to intercept boats in the ocean that were Russian boats and come directly in contact with Russians in efforts to enforce their sanctions. So now the question is the U.S. now going to be involved in enforcing their sanctions? And also the secondary question to that is, will the U.S. be involved in secondary sanctions against China, against India? Are we prepared to do that? So that is the question. We were going to do that just a couple months back against India until Donald Trump negotiated out of that. But these are the questions now that this brings up. This is a major escalation economically. And as we've seen in the past two or 3 years of this war, the Biden sanctions on Russia did nothing but hurt the U.S. dollar. They didn't actually cripple the Russian economy at all, despite what the Biden administration kept saying and what senators in our country kept saying, that the Russian economy was on the brink. That turned out to be completely false. And all it did was reduce trust globally for the U.S. dollar. And now we have the U.S. dollar losing its place as the world reserve currency. So all the Biden sanctions did was hurt the U.S. dollar, and it didn't do anything to affect the Russian economy. So now the question is, are these sanctions going to be for real? Are we really putting all of our effort into economically trying to cripple Russia when that hasn't worked in the past? So that's the question that comes up from those sanctions. And also in this article, you heard that there was a meeting scheduled between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin Yes, there was, just in the past week, there have been ideas floated out there of a potential meeting between the two leaders in Budapest, which is in Turkey, and that meeting fell apart after these. It fell apart a little before these sanctions. I believe it was as a result of that meeting falling apart that these sanctions were put in place. And let's just talk about the timeline here. We'll start back now last week when Zelensky visited the White House. So Zelensky came to the White House, and before Zelensky came to the White House, Donald Trump and Putin had a phone call, which Trump described as very good. And reportedly, in that phone call, Donald Trump was informed by Vladimir Putin that the Russians were willing to bend their negotiating stances a little bit. And reportedly, this included Russia offering the United States that they will leave the Donbass region of Ukraine in exchange for taking some of Kherson and some of Zaporizhia. These are multiple of the regions that Russia has taken in eastern Ukraine over the course of this war. They have pretty much gotten control of the entirety of all of these regions. And they're saying here that they're willing to leave the Donbass region in exchange for pieces of Kherson and Zaporizhia. This is a deal that right now is the best thing we're possibly going to get in this war. And Donald Trump went to Zelensky at this White House meeting last week, and apparently Zelensky said no, and a shouting match ensued in the White House. And Donald Trump, reportedly, according to the Financial Times article that came out in the aftermath, apparently Donald Trump said to accept the terms that Putin had put forward, or he told Zelensky be destroyed by Russia. So this is the current state of negotiations here, and this is where we get to the fact that the United States, during this entire term, we've failed to have a strict negotiating. We haven't had any stance in these negotiations. We're flip-flopping literally by the week, and this is the problem because we're sending so many mixed signals about what we're willing to do, and it's very unclear what our actual position is. So we have Zelensky now, who is listening to the Europeans. The Europeans have Zelensky's ear, and they're feeding him all this information as if not only are they going to get all the land of Ukraine back, but they're going to get Crimea back. And as we heard Donald Trump say in his over-the-top Truth Social post just like a month ago, he's like, maybe they'll even take parts of Russia. So we flipped now, and now we're in the position where we're telling Zelensky to accept some parts of his country being taken by Russia. So all of this is very confusing. We've flip-flopped multiple times throughout these negotiations. And back to the European point now, we have the Europeans urging Zelensky. The Europeans are sending Zelensky missiles, long-range missiles, and they're urging him to launch inside of Russia. This is a major escalation. And not only is it a major escalation, but it's an incredibly stupid one because Ukraine is not going to make up the ground gains. They're not going to make ground gains by launching missiles deep into Russia. They're not going to make ground gains at all. And that's the reality that nobody wants to confront because Ukraine on the front lines is fighting with 60-year-old men or older. They have lost men at an incredible rate. And nobody's trying to talk about this, but it's just the facts. And right now, the Ukrainian morale is also incredibly low. The Ukrainian country right now as a whole is completely decimated, and nobody wants to acknowledge that it's not physically possible for the Ukrainians, barring full-blown U.S. or European military support, to even have a chance to get their land back. And then the Europeans are leading them down the primrose path to destruction and telling them that everything will be fine and we'll have your back the entire way, all while we're not actually committed because we literally cannot commit to defending all of Ukraine. We simply factually cannot. It is not in the cards for the United States specifically to defend all of Ukraine. That's not a reality that anyone who's serious will tell you that we can do. And what you hear from the Europeans is that we can't allow Russia to take the land that they've taken in Ukraine. We can't allow something like this to happen on the international stage. We can't allow this aggressive power that is Russia to beat up on the small little Ukraine and take the land. But the word in that sentence that makes absolutely no sense is the word we cannot let. The word let. You're not letting them do anything. This is the delusion, the absolute delusion of these European leaders that don't have to face any of the real consequences of this because they're asking America to front the bill. You're not letting him do anything. He's violently taking the land, and you can't do anything about it. Berlin can't do anything about it. London can't do anything about it. Paris can't do anything about it. And in reality, DC can't really do anything about it unless we're willing to commit full-blown military support to Ukraine, which nobody besides maybe Lindsey Graham wants to do. So this is the reality that were faced on the ground. And not only does nobody want to do that, it's just not in our interest to do that. If we're thinking from an American perspective, because that's what we elect and the taxpayers pay our politicians to do, then it's not in our interest to be sending hundreds of billions of dollars to Ukraine to fight this endless fool's errand war to get their land back, because there's no possible way to get that land back. So it doesn't matter how many long-range missiles we send to Ukraine to have them launch into Moscow or whatever. They cannot get the land back on the ground by doing that. And in reality, Ukraine just cannot get the land back by themselves. Ukraine has 60-year-olds on the front line. So this idea that they're getting... And by the way, we're sending these missiles to Ukraine to have Ukraine launch them. And Europeans are sending these missiles to Ukraine to have Ukraine launch them. What they don't want to tell you is that in reality, who is launching the missiles? In many cases, it's American officials, it's French officials, it's British officials, it's German officials that are actually on the ground in Ukraine demonstrating to the Ukrainians how to use these, because many of these missiles require the intelligence of all these countries to launch, require the intelligence of these countries to track the coordinates of where they're trying to hit. So in reality, it's not even in many cases Ukrainians using the missiles. This is a full-blown, out-in-the-open proxy war between the West and Russia. And Ukraine is stuck in the middle in reality between these two powers that the West in reality has been wanting to go to war with Russia for decades. And Ukraine is just the proxy to achieve that. So Zelensky's just an actor in all this. Zelensky is keeping this whole charade up as if his country is going to get back all the land that has been taken, and he's being told by the Europeans that that's possible, when in reality it's just not. So that is the state of the war right now in Ukraine, and there's reporting coming out every day of the massive amounts of casualties and the fact that the Ukrainians have elderly people on the front lines. It's delusional. And you hear these war hawks talking about how it's actually possible. You still hear people in the year 2025 saying how it's possible for Crimea to get back to Ukraine. These people are sick and have no idea what's actually going on. These foreign policy experts have no idea what's actually going on the ground. Then they're just completely out of touch with reality. And they can't accept the fact that Ukraine has no chance against Russia. And the Europeans as a whole, if all the Europeans went to war with Russia, have no chance against Russia. The only chance that the West has is if America gets completely involved in this war. And I, for one, don't want that. And there's many Americans who do not want that. So that's the state of the war right now in Ukraine and Russia. We'll move on now to the latest in Israel, which is just, as usual, just completely ridiculous and dysfunctional, this relationship that our country has with this foreign country. And we had JD Vance in the midst of this ceasefire, which is right now on the brink of collapse because both sides are accusing each other of breaking the ceasefire. We've had reports that Israel has broken the ceasefire like 80 times. That's the now reported number that they've broken the ceasefire 80 times. And for some reason, we can still consider the ceasefire alive. It doesn't make any sense, but okay, the U.S. is in full-blown emergency mode trying to make sure that the ceasefire stays alive. Even though, in reality, we don't have a ceasefire because there's been no stoppage of fire. There's been a decrease in the amount of fire going back and forth, but there's been no stop. It has not ceased. So this delusion that there's been a ceasefire is just completely wrong. But right now, we have JD Vance, Witkoff, and Kushner they're returning now from Israel. They went on basically an emergency visit to babysit Netanyahu to make sure that the ceasefire stays in place because we've had the Israelis basically threatening to end the ceasefire. And while JD Vance is in town, we had the Knesset, which is basically the Israeli Congress. The Knesset voted on a proposition to move forward with annexation of the West Bank. While JD Vance is in town representing the Trump administration, the administration that's made it clear their position on this, which is that they don't want Israel to annex the West Bank. The blatant disrespect is just a slap in the face to the United States, and we put up with it every single time. Here's JD Vance's direct response to this.
Sorry,
yeah, go ahead. We'll do. Yeah.
The West Bank vote yesterday that took place while you were in the country.
Oh yeah, that was weird. I was sort of confused by that. Now I actually asked somebody about it, and they told me that it was a symbolic vote, some symbolic vote to recognize or a symbolic vote to annex the West Bank. I mean, what I would say to that is when I asked about it, somebody told me that it was a political stunt. that it had no practical significance. It was purely symbolic. I mean, look, if it was a political stunt, it was a very stupid political stunt, and I personally take some insult to it. The West Bank is not going to be annexed by Israel. The policy of the Trump administration is that the West Bank will not be annexed by Israel. That will continue to be our policy. And if people want to take symbolic votes, they can do that. But we certainly weren't happy about it.
Now, the reports are that that Netanyahu has now halted this effort and that it will not move forward. But the arrogance that is just oozing out of this country is insanity. Like, imagine you're being completely, your government, basically, and your entire defense industry is being completely propped up by the United States and by United States government, public-private military companies. Your entire defense for your country is being propped up by another country. And that when that country's leaders come to town, you just completely go against that administration's interest and just do a complete slap in the face political stunt to tell him, we'll actually do whatever we want, thank you very much. It's just a complete slap in the face to everyone in the United States that pays for Israel's defense and funds their seven-front war across the region. It's unreal. And especially when Trump was so strict in laying out his position on this topic. Just a couple weeks ago, I believe we either played it or talked about it here on the show. We had Trump saying very clearly, very, very obviously that he will not allow Israel to annex the West Bank. Yet here we are, the entire Israeli Knesset is voting to annex the West Bank. So this country has no respect for us, actually. We have to just acknowledge that. The leaders of this country have zero respect for the country that props them up. And maybe it's time to rethink this relationship. Maybe it's time to cut them off because they're obviously going against our interest. It's not in our interest to have Israel annex the West Bank. And apparently Trump has now told the Arab leaders in the region that if Israel moves forward with that plan, that we're going to cut off aid. Now, my question for that is, why is this the point? Why have we not cut it off sooner? Why have we not cut it off right now? And we all can see now that it is their end goal to annex the West Bank. That's out in the open. Their politicians just voted on the record that is their position. Yet we just pretend that these gaps in policy don't exist. We pretend that there is a complete agreement on every single foreign policy issue between America and Israel. Yet there's votes over and over in the Knesset that prove otherwise. Yet we are forced, or we choose to ignore that and pretend that everything's fine. We stand next to Netanyahu for these photo ops. We go to the wall every visit and show complete solidarity with whatever Israel wants to do in the region, even when it goes directly against the stated position of the United States president. It's unbelievable. So that is the latest in Israel. We also had Marco Rubio. He's there now. JD Vance left yesterday. Marco Rubio is in Israel, or he should be arriving there very soon if he hasn't arrived already. And this is just a mad rush at this point from the Trump administration to keep this ceasefire in place. Because if Israel breaks this ceasefire, what an embarrassment that would be for this administration. So they cannot allow that to happen. They acknowledge that. And we'll see what happens now with this ceasefire. It is very close to breaking at this point. We'll see what happens. I hope it doesn't, because the killing has gone very much down. It hasn't stopped, but it's gone down. And we'll see what happens. Hopefully it stays in place. But that's where I think I'll end it off for today. Thank you guys so much for watching. Please be sure to like and subscribe right down below this video. Please go follow me on Instagram, X, and Spotify. And I'll see you guys in the next episode. Have a good day.
Americanism, not globalism.
I am not a slave. I am a free citizen.
There should be no Federal Reserve system.
Only America first.